think it makes sense to actually move on to a point we were going to get to slightly later, because you spoke about the commercial understanding of the business there. And funny enough, I was speaking to someone about this last week, and it is really a way for us to understand where we can have impact if we know where our business or departments make money and where their biggest opportunities to make money are, or to drive impact on the bottom line. And Sam, part of that is getting more comfortable with business data, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. I think Neil kind of just made this point perfectly in what he's talking about just a second ago. And I think a lot of most of my hacks really have come from kind of earlier in my career, where I've realized, yeah, I've had that ego check, and I've realized that I've not kind of necessarily been doing as good a job as I could have been. And I used to kind of, I guess I used to just glaze over when I was even when I was in kind of like leadership team meetings, and we weren't talking about learning and development, and they were talking about business performance and things. I didn't glaze over and switch off and disengage, but I kind of just thought, I don't quite know what they're on about, but I'm not going to just sit here and ask them loads of questions. Basically, my hack is do the opposite of that. Ask loads of questions. Be really curious. What does this mean? What does that mean? And then you can kind of start understanding, okay, so what are the metrics that essentially I had a senior stakeholder who asked me how I thought learning and development could positively impact a particular measure that they were struggling with. And I didn't understand what the measure was. I couldn't even BS it. I couldn't, I just had to say, I'm not sure, because I'm not quite sure what that measure is. And so I got found out big time, was embarrassed. And so after then, again, I kind of was vulnerable and said, look, I really want to understand more. So whenever I was in a meeting, I asked questions. Sometimes I felt like a schoolboy, and it was a bit embarrassing. But most of the time, again, if people want to talk about stuff that they know about and are interested in themselves, so most of the time it really helped. And I think then you can, the key kind of follow on to that is, if you understand the metrics that businesses use to measure their successes as a business, you can then also start to understand what are the kind of sub metrics that they use to measure things like progress towards that, and indirect kind of measures of success that aren't necessarily on a kind of P&L or on their kind of data sheets, but actually you can be really interested in, because if you impact that, which is potentially a smaller measure, you're going to positively impact the kind of the bigger measure that they are interested in. So yeah, be interested, be curious, ask loads of questions. You don't know what a particular metric is, or a data point is, or a acronym, or whatever it is, ask the question. You'll always get that question answered, and it will make you a far more strategic and effective business partner.
Yeah, I love this sub-metrics point, because actually a great example would be to come back to sales. And Neil, you might correct me if I'm wrong here, but a lot of the time, maybe people are looking at what the revenue target is. But actually, if we want to get to revenue, we have to have X amount of pipeline, and then we actually need a percentage of that pipeline to convert. So if we, first of all, it starts with understanding the final metric, but then there are these sub-metrics to work back from and say, all these other things need to happen. But if we don't know that final metric, we won't work backwards. So I guess that's kind of what I'm trying to get to there. Lauren, I saw you nodding as well. Actually, I know Neil, you've got a great tip on data as well, but Lauren, I saw you nodding to what some of Sam was sharing there. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on getting closer to that business metric and understanding sort of business data as well.
Absolutely. So I was nodding on and getting excited, because the thing that goes through my head every time someone says asking a dumb question and being brave about it is that if you're thinking it, probably somebody else is as well. And so sometimes being that brave person that, stands up and says, can you explain this to me? Somebody else in the back of the room is probably also going, oh my gosh, thank goodness. But also if we don't understand what that metric is and how learning can influence our performance on that metric, how can anyone else in the business understand that as well? Is this information that we can include as part of our learning interventions to say, here is what we're trying to achieve as a business. This experience will help us to move the needle on this, which means then that we are ultimately more successful. It's a real shortcut to getting people excited to show up or log in or watch whatever you're trying to get them to watch, because they see that direct line with the money or the outcome or the customer experience. So yeah, if we don't know, then probably no one else in the business gets it either.
Yeah, Oh, I can completely relate there. I was on a call with, like it was a marketing call the other day, and someone slapped me going, "What does this mean?" And I was like, "Oh, I don't know either, actually. One of us best ask." Because then if you don't, I've been stuck on the other end of it. I pretended I knew what something meant for like 6 months, and it's too late then. I can't ask now. Then I really do look stupid because someone will say, "We've been talking about this project for 6 months. What do you mean? You don't know what it is?" So, yeah, I love that. Neil, any thoughts on that data point in general? And then it'd be a good segue into your tip on how we can take that data and tell better stories with it as well.
Yeah, just to go back to Sam's thinking about asking the questions. It reminded me of a piece I'm working on at the moment where we're putting together the data story for a customer who've used a mix of internal and external providers to deliver a solution to about a population of 700 people over a year. And I was just trying to find out who's responsible for the metrics. That's performance metrics. The one thing that reminded me of, there's always someone who's responsible for that in the business, whether or not you're 10 people or you're 25,000, there's always someone who's responsible for that. So ask that question, who's responsible for it? And then something that I'm surprised by each time I do this is when you find out who's responsible for those metrics, usually, I'm not saying this happens all the time, they're asked to provide it, maybe do some analysis, but they're very rarely asked to link it to learning objectives or to help you think about it in terms of people's overall performance or trend reporting on that. And then when you find out the person from finance whose job it is to take the performance metric and put a monetized unit amount against it, you get those two people together and they've never talked about this, so they're really excited about doing it as well. So you kind of infuse two people in teams that wouldn't normally be part of the process that can then help you in the future. But yeah, in terms of data storytelling, I think the key piece here is not to get, it might sound counterintuitive, too bogged down in the data, right? So it has to be about the story as well. And I use kind of a simple narrative device called the hero's tale, which goes a little bit something like, our heroes have set out on the journey. They've been through some adversity. Yeah, that's the learning. They've overcome it. That's it, getting better performance. And here's the end of the story. Here's your outcome. So it's a real simple narrative device. But the key piece is what's next. And what that allows you to do when you're playing this story back is, if everything's gone really well, great, here's what we're going to do next. But if it's not gone well, okay, that's okay. This was just chapter 1. Here's what chapter 2 is going to look like, and here's how we're going to address it as well. So it kind of helps people understand that, yeah, you know, people aren't just a number. They have their own story that they're going through, but these two things can be brought together in terms of learning and development.
No, I love that point on the hero's tale. Funny enough, I went to like a marketing conference probably like 5 or 6 years ago now. But this guy gave a talk where he broke down the biggest sort of ads in terms of reach for that year, and loads of them were based on that whole hero's tale thing, because essentially it puts the person watching it in the position of the main person in the story, something they can relate to. And a lot of the time, if you just go too hard into the data, then you'll lose people. But if you start with the person and the personal story, and then weave the data into the narrative, how they got to that final point, it will relate far better to people. Sam and Lauren, any thoughts on how you take that data? Now we know where it is, who's responsible for it. How do we take that, tell good stories to win more people over in the business, improve our brand like we spoke about earlier, get more buy-in, all that good stuff?
I think for me, just really simply, it's also just about making sure that you're pulling insight from the data that's meaningful to the audiences that you're offering it up to. So actually, a lot of people in businesses don't care if the business is performing that well. As daft as it sounds, there's a lot of people in businesses who do. There's a lot of people in businesses who don't. They might care about other things though. They might care about their team members who have like smashed a target, or they might care about someone in a department who has done something new for the first time, you know, achieved a particular measure that they've never been able to achieve before. And that, for me, that's about kind of the stories. I think it comes down to not just kind of data storytelling in its more broad, here was our problem initially, as Neil talked about, which absolutely is kind of critical, but also how do we use data and insight to tell stories about the success that we're having, kind of even on a potentially more personal, individual scale.
Yeah, I think it's big stories and small stories, isn't it? If we hit our financial goal, that'll only happen every few months and it feels a bit disconnected. But like you say, if someone in my team has just like smashed a call and we've been working together, or they've just hit a target, like these are small wins day to day, and actually those small stories add up. Lauren, any thoughts as well before we move on to the final tip? The time has absolutely flown by, so we'll speed up a little, I guess.
I just agree. Love storytelling. It's the way to get people to remember the things that you're talking about. And if you want to one up it, if you can get them to start telling stories of success and start feeding that information to them to tell other people, you're just going to have that wildfire effect, getting people excited.